We are going to be talking about Gaza. We're going to go over the death toll, the civilian-to-combatant ratio. We're going to investigate alleged war crimes and more. Depending on who you ask, you will hear very different narratives about Gaza. One side will say, Israel's engaging in the best way possible, lowest civilian-to-combatant ratio in modern history. They're essentially achieving a new standard of urban warfare. The other side is saying that the IDF are essentially Nazis that are currently genociding the Palestinians. In reality, as with most things, it seems the truth is somewhere in between. The conclusions I reached in short are that we are seeing a level of force being used in Gaza unseen in recent history. We're seeing a higher civilian to combatant death ratio above the global average, despite what many are saying. We're seeing a level of children being killed, unlike which we've seen in recent history, and what I would describe as an unprecedented amount of war crimes being committed. Now, it's important to make clear that while we're seeing unprecedented levels of harm being caused towards Palestinians, we're also seeing the most challenging fighting conditions in recent history. A militant group that is hiding in tunnels underneath a densely populated city, and Israel's mission is to destroy that militant group. It's a very difficult challenge. Now, according to both international law and common sense, the fact that it's a challenge does not absolve Israel of responsibility. The warring party still needs to take precautions to reduce civilian harm, and we have mountains of evidence at this point that that is not what is happening. Why am I doing this? Why am I coming on stream and speaking bad about a country I'm a citizen of? A country that I actually love, a country that my whole family lives in? Well, I feel a moral obligation. I served in the IDF. I'm a citizen of Israel. I pay taxes to that government. I feel a moral obligation to speak out against what I consider to be some of the most horrific atrocities of the 21st century. And the evidence of this is overwhelming. I'm not just being hyperbolic. I also want people to have a realistic understanding of the cost of this war. Right? There's a lot of misinformation. Many people think this is the best fought war in modern history, that for each combatant killed, there's one civilian killed. Well, none of that is actually true. So if people want to support the war, I would like for them to have a realistic understanding of the cost of this war. And honestly, I want to see Israel thrive. Israel is a country that I lived in for half my life. My entire family lives there. Most of my family relies on the state of Israel for protection. I don't want to see Israel destroyed. I want to see Israel thrive, but I believe she's headed down a dark path, and only through having these challenging conversations can we hope to transform Israel positively. And more than anything, I really just want to see peace on the land. I want to see a future where Israelis and Palestinians are living side by side in peace with one another, and I believe that to be possible. Now, as I'm saying a lot of this, many of you may be saying, wait a minute, I saw an article by John Spencer, West Point Urban Warfare Studies. He says something completely different. Yeah, Spencer, and I don't say this word lightly, he is a fraud. And this video won't be about John Spencer on his own, but you will see how many of the claims he makes are just inaccurate and dishonest. I may make a video down the line specifically about John Spencer. And the reason I'm mentioning him is because he's the number one cited person for those trying to defend Israel's actions in Gaza. They believe there is a person from a place of authority who is saying this is the best fought war in history. They use him as an authority. His claims should be judged on their merit, as all claims, as with my claims. The fact that I served in the IDF don't give me any more legitimacy to be making these claims. Yeah, it did give me some insight as to the culture of the IDF. It allowed me to speak to friends who served in Gaza to get a greater insight. But the results I reached are primarily a result of just doing research on available information. So do not take my word for what I'm saying. You can fact check me, reach your own conclusions. What methodology did I use to reach conclusions? Because it's very hard to know what's true in the fog of war. Most of what's happening is not being recorded, so we don't have a full picture. We need to use the data we have available to us. So the data we have available to us is in the form of photos and videos from IDF soldiers, from drones, from satellites, as well as from Gazans. We have testimonials from IDF whistleblowers, journalists, and doctors. I'm relying heavily on data that is verifiable, right? So we'll often hear a claim made by Israel or a claim made by Hamas. These claims without verifiable data, I take with a grain of salt, especially during times of war. Warring parties have an incentive to frame things to their benefit. This is not just a war for military gain, but also for PR. So again, I'm not going to use anything that Israel says or that Hamas says at face value. There would need to be corresponding evidence to back up that claim. I try to look for different forms of evidence to corroborate claims, right? So let's say we get a testimonial from an IDF whistleblower. That testimonial has no other evidence to back it up, like other testimonials, like photo or video evidence. Then I also take that with a grain of salt because technically a whistleblower could be lying. So I try to look for corroborating evidence for any claim being made. I also look at the motivations and incentives at play, right? What are the incentives at play? How does this impact both sides and the decisions that they make? I think this is essential. Doing all of this can allow us to get a relatively clear picture of what's going on. It does not give us the exact numbers of those killed. You'll see I'm going to present a range. The size of that range is really a result of not having all the information. Right, so let's really talk about that range. Right, how many civilians have been killed in Gaza? We really don't know, but I estimate that it is between 50,000 to 150,000 civilians. Now, this may surprise many because both the Gaza Ministry of Health and the UN are saying it's only 43,000. How are you going to say it's more than what the Gaza Ministry of Health is saying? It's not that they're saying 43,000 have been killed. They're saying 43,000 have been confirmed killed. That's very different. Generally, in times of war, it takes many months to years to identify all those being killed. We've seen record levels of infrastructural damage in Gaza, so we do not know how many people are unaccounted for or buried under rubble. And we also, these 43,000 are not including indirect deaths, those dying from the collapse of the healthcare system, from disease and malnutrition. And the way we know these are not being included is because if they were including indirect deaths, we would see an unusual spike in deaths amongst babies and elderly. We do not see this spike. Now, how do we even know if we could trust these names being released? This is actually, there's this massive misconception, and I was actually surprised to discover this myself. The Gaza Ministry of Health is actually quite meticulous in the reporting, more meticulous than any other Ministry of Health is during wartime. And we actually have a unique situation where the warring party has access to the population registry of the other side. This does not exist generally in conflict. So generally, when you want to know casualty count, you need to blindly trust the side reporting on the numbers. But in the case of Israel and Gaza, we don't need to blindly trust because every name and ID that the Ministry of Health releases exists in the Palestinian population registry, which is controlled by Israel. Israel can very easily cross-reference and see that these names are real and that these people exist. And if they were fabricating, we would hear about this from Israel. It wouldn't even take an intelligence unit to do it. A low-level bureaucrat can do this. Somebody from the Ministry of Interior could do this as a passion project. It would not be hard to discredit this list. We know that the Ministry of Health has verifiable data, and we also know that they're historically reliable. Their numbers are generally similar to what the IDF themselves will claim, and they are also similar to what human rights organizations will say, historically speaking. Now, I have been trying to look for other vectors of fabrication. If the Ministry of Health was really trying to cheat the numbers, how would they do it? So we're going to go through different ways they could potentially fabricate, and none of them really are compelling. Some of them are quite conspiratorial, and it's a whole lot of effort to go through with relatively little to gain. It also shouldn't be hard to believe, like, you have 2.5 million people living in Gaza. 85,000 tons of explosives have been dropped on Gaza. That's more than all the major cities in World War II. That's a tiny place for a whole lot of explosives. The fact that they've used 85,000 tons of explosives and only killed 50 to 150,000 is a sign, on one hand, that they're not trying to maximize civilian harm. On the other hand, it is demonstrating a level of aggression and force, unlike which we've seen in recent conflict. And it shouldn't be so surprising, the death toll we're currently seeing. But let's look at these potential rooms for fabrication. So they can't just fake names because Israel could easily prove that. But what if they were putting people who are still alive, right? Let's say people are living, they just add them to the list to add the numbers. Well, if they were doing this in any meaningful way, meaning like adding thousands of people, all it would take is the IDF to arrest one person or get a video or photo of a single person, social media activity of a person, have somebody from Gaza come out and say, why am I on the list? The idea of adding thousands of live people on the list with no evidence is highly unlikely. It really is. I mean, there's a lot of surveillance of Gaza, there's a lot of intel. This whole idea that we could add thousands of living people to the list and wouldn't be a shred of evidence. Is it possible? Sure, it's possible, but the likelihood is very low. Right? The Gaza Ministry of Health and the healthcare system is under immense amounts of pressure. They're not even able to report properly on everything happening, which is another reason to think that what they've reported is only really talking about some amount of the total amount of deaths. Like they don't have the capacity to have a functioning reporting system like they normally do because of the damage their healthcare system has taken. So to think, given all this strain, they're also now just going through the Palestinian population registry and trying to take living people and add them to the list. They don't know, are these people under arrest in Israeli prison, which would very easily prove that they're lying. Like the idea of them doing this effectively during time of war is just so unlikely. But I do know people really, really try to cast doubt on anything they say and are looking for any way to discredit them because they don't want to believe that these numbers are real. So that's why I'm going through this. I already know the pushback that's going to be received because have already given this pushback. Now, what's another way they could manipulate? So we've found some inconsistencies in the data. They release a list every few months. So they released one in April and then they released one in June. In April, there was incomplete data. There was some amount of the names that had incomplete data. And then in June, they released the list and they filled out and updated and completed all the missing data. People saw this as a sign. It's like, oh, look, they're just making up claims. If they could just make up names and ID numbers, why would they in any way, shape, or form put incomplete data in when they're under the public scrutiny? If they could just make up names and ID numbers, there's no reason they would release a list with incomplete data. The fact that they updated it to complete the data shows they're trying to be as accurate as possible. The accusation that because they have updated data, therefore making the data up, is not really a coherent hypothesis. Not to mention, before they released the list in April, they did go on the record saying we're going to release this list with incomplete data. And they explained why. They said our systems are not functioning properly. We're trying to put together a report as best we can, but it's incomplete. They actually came out and said that before doing it. And then in June, upon having time to complete the numbers, they updated it all. If anything, this points to a level of an effort of trying to be as accurate as possible. Now, I think they made a mistake. I don't think they should have released any incomplete data because they're under public scrutiny and people do use this against them. Another thing we are hearing, that another vector for fabrication, we're saying, how do we know that Hamas aren't killing some of these people and that they're being added to the list? Well, that actually might be happening, right? The Ministry of Health are adding to the list bodies that have been seen, dead bodies have been seen. If Hamas kills somebody and they come into the hospital, they see somebody shot, they very well may assume that's the IDF. So there is reason to believe that some amount of those killed have been killed either directly by Hamas or by misfired rockets. But when you look at what amount of deaths that would constitute, it's actually negligible. One way to look at it, we often hear 20% of all rockets fall within Gaza and they kill massive amounts of civilians. The evidence doesn't really back that up. The evidence does not back that up at all. One way to look at this is during the 2021 war, Israel claims that 13 people were killed from Hamas rockets. Now, less rockets were shot, but if we think it's going to have a similar death rate than it did in 2021 now, if we correct for the amount of rockets being killed, we're talking about max of like 1 to 200 people. And we don't have evidence of Hamas massacring hundreds or even thousands of their own people currently. There's zero evidence of this. And if that were to be the case, we would see evidence. We'd have testimonials, we'd have video and photo evidence of massive amounts of people being killed in a way that will impact the data. So I actually think there very well may be a case where people being killed by Hamas have been added to this list, but we're talking about a negligible amount that constitutes less than 1% or 1%. So it's not changing the data in any meaningful way. Now, how do we arrive at this estimate of civilians? Because they're not differentiating between combatants and civilians, right? So let's look at the numbers the Ministry of Health releases. They say that 43,000 civilians have been killed, but of those, 34,344 have been fully identified. We have their name and ID number. So when they release the list, they're releasing the list of 34,344. When we look at the demographics of that list, we see that 58% are women and children. It's fair to assume that the overwhelming majority of women and children are civilians. We often hear claims of child soldiers, but we actually have not seen much evidence of child soldiers, not enough to change the data in a meaningful way. And one way to look at that, if we compare the amount of girls that have been killed to the amount of boys that have been killed, you've only had 1,400 more boys killed than girls. So we could assume that those 1,400 boys were militants. But we also know in times of war, men and teenage boys are often killed at a higher rate because they're confused of being militants and they're taking risks like going out to get food and water. This is true of every conflict in recent history. Civilian men die at a higher rate as civilian women. This is true of teenage boys as well. And we also see a similar differential when we look at elderly men and elderly women. We could assume that those 1,400 or so boys are militants, but in reality, it's likely significantly less than that because we know they're more likely to be killed. Of this list, 58% are women, children, and elderly. So we have 42% are men. How many of those men are civilian? It's really hard to know, but if we assume that civilian women and civilian men are dying at a similar rate, then we would get to 78% of this list being civilians. That's if they're dying at the same rate. I don't see any reason to believe that civilian women are dying at a higher rate. Other armed conflicts, and there will be a source to this, as with all other things I'm saying, all other armed conflicts have civilian men dying at a rate that is 30%, all the way to 890% more than women. So this list, these 34,344 names, is anywhere between 78% civilians all the way to 95+% civilians. Again, the reason we have that range is because we don't know at what rate higher they're being killed than civilian women. We do have reason to believe, though, that like in all other conflicts, men are being killed at a higher rate. I'm going to read a testimonial from a whistleblower. This is an IDF soldier that served in the IDF. B said that it was difficult to distinguish civilians from combatants in Gaza, claiming that members of Hamas often walk around without their weapons. But as a result, every man between the age of 16 and 50 is suspected of being a terrorist. Right? So this speaks to the challenging conditions, the fact that because of how Hamas operate, it is a very challenging operation, but this also points to the fact that men are being targeted. Military-age men are being targeted. We also see more evidence of this by the mass arrests of military-age men. Many of them we know are innocent because they get released days or weeks after they get arrested, and because their family members come out and pointing the fact that they're just doctors or they do this. And we're getting a lot of testimonials that they have zero connection to Hamas. Do we need to believe the family members? No, but this is corroborated both by the fact that many of them are being released after some time, and by the fact that if you don't know who's Hamas and who's not, and you want to play it safe, then you're going to suspect every military-age man. And this really, really speaks to and we'll get deeper into this, but how both sides are looking at this, right? Israel cares first and foremost about their soldiers and civilians. If that comes at the expense of harming civilians on the other side, that is a decision they are going to make. And this is true of every country. Every country is going to prefer their soldiers over the civilians of an enemy. This is why we have and need international law to protect civilians of the opposing side. And we will get more into that. So how do we reach 50 to 150,000? Well, if we were to assume, let's say that 90% of the list are civilians. Now, just because this list of those killed is 90% civilians, that doesn't mean 90% of those killed are civilians, right? It very well may be the case that combatants are not being added to the list at the same rate, right? This is something I have no way to check or prove, but it very well may be the case that if you're a militant and dying, you're not being brought to a hospital, you're being buried by your unit, and the list is heavily underrepresenting militants being killed. This not only may be the case, I would say there's a good chance of this being the case. If we were to assume that 90% of the list are civilians, then we have around 30,000 civilian deaths. It could be less, it could be more. This is an estimate, but you'll see the range I give accounts for all of this. As I mentioned earlier, we know in war that many, if not most, of those killed take a while to be identified. They may be under rubble. They may not yet be accounted for. Less than half the hospitals in Gaza are currently operational. Also, the hospitals that are operational are just completely over capacity. So you could see a situation, let's say somebody is killed. What is the point of the family even bringing them into the hospital? They may just be burying them. So we don't know how many people are being buried without going to the hospital, right? So It's possible that the majority of those killed have not yet been accounted for. We really don't know. Again, that's why I'm estimating this wide range between 50 to 150,000. We also know that there are some amount of indirect deaths. You have widespread malnutrition and disease in Gaza, and you don't have the medical infrastructure to deal with all these people. This will primarily impact babies and elderly. The Ministry of Health did say that they are going to release a list of indirect deaths shortly. That has not been released yet, but I'm waiting to see. In other conflicts, sometimes the majority of those killed are killed from indirect deaths. So again, we don't know the number. But there was a controversial Lancet article that said 186,000 people are going to be killed in Gaza. It was very controversial, but the way they reached that conclusion is looking at other conflicts, seeing the amount of indirect deaths per direct deaths, and reaching a conclusion. They're not saying that's how many people currently are dead. They're saying that's how many people they predict will be killed. And the way they reach that number is really connected to indirect deaths. Here's another quote from a whistleblower. There are more fatalities than are reported. We were in a small area. Every day, at least one or two civilians are killed because they walked in a no-go area. I don't know who is a terrorist and who is not, but most of them did not carry weapons. This speaks also to the fact that the death toll is likely higher, what is being stated, and also that men are being targeted. And they speak about a no-go zone. This is where a lot of the civilians that are just being shot or executed or sniped, we do have evidence of this happening. It seems like most of this is happening in what is called a no-go area. A no-go area is an area that is meant to be evacuated. The IDF, they no longer need permission to take shots in a no-go zone. Some are referring it to a kill zone. It's a zone where there's way more lenience with shooting those you see, because the assumption, and it's a false assumption for many reasons, but the assumption is this is no-go zone. Whoever stays must be a terrorist. There's many reasons people are not evacuating. One is they just want to defy the orders of the IDF. They're not going to listen to an invading force. Second, they might have young children at home and elderly family, and they don't want to walk across Gaza. They're hearing that the paths are not safe. There are instances of mass arrests of military-aged men on these paths. People on these paths have gotten attacked. Some will claim it's Hamas attacking, others will claim it's IDF. My point is just to show these paths are not safe, and they're going to go to a place where they're going to live in a tent with no running water, with disease and a bunch of sick people, only to maybe get attacked there because these safe zones have been attacked as well. So you could see the rationale to stay home with your young children or elderly. I'm not saying this is the right decision, but that does not give you a freebie to just take shots. It doesn't. And international law would agree with this. Another way to look at this is the amount of children that have been killed. Based on the list, the 34,000 names we currently have, there are 11,355 children, meaning people under the age of 18. Aleppo has a similar population to Gaza. The war there was 4 years, and I'm using this because this was also primarily urban combat. It was widely considered to be a humanitarian disaster. Assad is widely considered to be a war criminal, and NATO considered an invading because of this humanitarian crisis. Aleppo only had 5,261 children killed over 4 years. Israel is over 11,000, and this isn't accounting those who have not yet been accounted for, while in Aleppo we've had time to account for everybody. It's true, Gaza has a higher child population than Aleppo, not by a significant margin, and it's true that the conditions are different. But I'm using this as a reference point just to show the cost of this war, this idea that it's just being conducted so beautifully and the toll is low. Again, the children are dying at a rate orders of magnitude higher than Aleppo, which was widely considered to be a humanitarian crisis. And the difference is this is a war that's being funded by the United States. So when we see protests around the world, protests in America, people say, oh, this is hypocrisy, it's anti-Semitism. No, this is a perfectly legitimate thing to protest. And when we look at the war in Iraq, we saw record levels of protests against the war in Iraq. George W. Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, and Dick Cheney are widely considered to be war criminals. We saw significantly less civilians relative to population size being killed there. We saw a lower civilian-to-combatant ratio there and less children. And this is true of all these conflicts we could look at. We want to look at Syria. We want to look at Russia, Ukraine. By every measure we could look at, less civilians are dying relative to militants, less civilians are dying relative to the total population size, and a lower ratio of children are being killed by significant margins. So again, this whole idea that people are upset with Israel and the fact that the U.S. is funding Israel and calling Netanyahu a war criminal, this is all very legitimate and consistent based on how we've behaved with other conflicts when we've seen a massive toll to civilian life. Now, I'm not going to say that anti Semitism doesn't fuel these movements. It certainly does, but you could remove every ounce of anti Semitism from the anti Israel movement, and there would still be a justified reason to be against this. And even if you're under the belief that this is primarily Hamas's responsibility, I know that is a viewpoint. The fact that Hamas is not acting responsibly, which they're not, and they're putting their civilians in danger, that doesn't absolve Israel of their responsibility. And again, international law, as well as common sense, will tell you that when parties are warring, neither side is absolved of responsibility for civilians harmed that are caught in the middle. Now, let's try to get an understanding of the civilian to combatant ratio. We often hear that the global standard is 9-1, 9 civilians to each combatant. This is not true. This is one of those John Spencer quotes or data points that he often points to, and many people repeat. That is not true. The average is not 9-1. In fact, I will challenge you to find me a conflict where you're seeing 9-1 that's not generally referred to as a genocide. 9-1 is not the standard. Where does this come from? The UN released a press statement where they were quoting one of the speakers that said 90% of casualties of war are civilians. That speaker is wrong. Where was that speaker getting their information from? There was a study in the 90s that determined that 90% of victims of war are civilians. Victims includes economic harm as well. Well, that makes perfect sense. But when we actually look at the data of other conflicts, again, source below, but when we look at the data of other conflicts, we see that urban warfare, not just conflicts, urban warfare specifically, because that's how you make a fair comparison, are much closer to 2-1, 2 civilians for every combatant. Israel is much likely closer to 4-1 or even 5-1. Again, we don't know because we don't know the exact amount of civilians killed, and we don't know how many combatants have been killed. Israel says it's 20,000, which, again, there's no evidence of this, so I think it should be taken with a grain of salt. But let's say they're telling the truth, it's 20,000. If only 40,000 civilians have been killed, then we're at 2-1. But that is a very, very low estimate. In reality, the number is likely closer to 80 to 100,000, and we're talking around 4-1, double the world average. By most metrics available to us, we can conclude with a high degree of certainty that the civilian to combatant ratio is significantly higher than the global average, despite what many are saying. And again, I've challenged anybody who wants to debate this. You can come on after I'm done with this report, and you could debate me. Challenge John Spencer to debate. He rejected, but I'm happy to debate anybody on this. I feel confident enough in what I'm saying. Now, as we said, the conditions in Gaza are tougher. That certainly is playing into it. I don't deny that for a minute. And the precaution we are seeing is evacuations, and we're seeing also policy at times be used called roof tapping. But roof tapping is interesting. People often cite this roof tapping as evidence of Israel going above and beyond because other countries don't roof tap to nearly the same extent. But roof tapping is only used if there's no militants in the building. If there's militants in the building, then you're not going to roof tap because then they escape. You only roof tap when you destroy a building that has only civilians in it. The other reason other countries don't generally roof tap is because they don't really take down civilian infrastructure to the same extent. They're not destroying that many buildings that are only with civilians. So this precaution Israel takes is actually a result of increased aggression. Now, I want us to assess not just the harm to human life, but also the infrastructural damage, because this helps us get a bigger picture about Israel's strategy in this war and how the precautions they're taking or their strategy is, no matter how they go about it, is going to disproportionately harm civilians. When we look at an analysis of the infrastructural damage, and this is analysis done using satellite imagery, radar, and high-resolution images, as well as field-proof geolocated data. An estimated 80% of buildings in Gaza are damaged or destroyed. There's been no other conflict with these numbers, not Aleppo, not Mosul, nothing. This is an entirely novel and new amount of buildings damaged and destroyed. Now, you need to ask yourself, it's true that the conditions in Gaza are unique, but this is more of a reason not to destroy buildings. Combatants are underground, hiding, while civilians have nowhere to go. They can't leave Gaza, they can't use the tunnels, they don't have bomb shelters. So this heavy infrastructural damage is going to disproportionately harm civilians, not militants. Militants are able to hide from this. So this whole idea of flattening Gaza on top of tunnels, it's not surprising that we're seeing a civilian to combatant ratio that's very unusual and amongst the highest in recent history. But it brings into question the strategy of causing so much infrastructural damage when those you're actually going after are hiding in tunnels. It's a cruel strategy. Even if you're telling people to leave, Think about what it's like to be in Gaza, right? It's this tiny strip of land. You have nowhere to go. You can't leave Gaza. You're being told to leave your home. Your neighborhood's destroyed. You go in a tent, that might get hit. After a month, you're told you could go home, and then maybe you're told to evacuate again. The Gazan people are being sent from one place of Gaza to the next, to the next, to the next, and just slowly being hit and killed along the way. You need to imagine what life in Gaza is like for 100% of those living there. Now, we'll get more into the cost and what other approaches we could take. Is there a different strategy? What could Israel actually do? We'll get into all this, but I really want us to just get a sense of how much harm has been caused to civilians while the combatants have the privilege of hiding underneath in secure bunkers and tunnels. We mentioned 80% of buildings in Gaza are damaged or destroyed. This includes commercial buildings, cropland, roads, schools, hospitals, medical facilities, vital infrastructure like water sanitation and sewage infrastructure. There's zero justification to destroy water sanitation and sewage infrastructure. I would also say there's zero justification to destroy medical facilities. The claim is that Hamas are using these medical facilities. The only evidence we have is that they're using these medical facilities to get treated, not to launch attacks. There's not been any evidence, and I've looked into this, there's not been any evidence of attacks being launched from hospitals. We do know that militants use hospitals to get care. We also know that they brought hostages to hospitals. Well, that makes sense. Where are they going to get the care for the hostages, right? So the justification to destroy a medical facility needs to be pretty damn high. That's vital infrastructure that people are going to need, especially in time of war. Cropland, right? We want to talk about the malnutrition in Gaza. It's not only about the fact that there's a problem with the distribution of food. It's just also they don't have the ability to farm their own food. Roads are destroyed, right? So this is getting food from point A to point B. Less than half of 36 hospitals are still functioning, right? So at a time where you have record amount of injury, disease, and malnutrition, you have a record low amount of functioning hospitals. This is leading to the humanitarian crisis we're currently seeing. Now, again, even with these precautions Israel has taken, a military's actions should be judged not by precautions taken, but by the actual harm they're causing. This needs to be the metric we look at. The harm they're causing relative to the military gain they're achieving. And let's get into the principle of proportionality, because that's what it states. The principle of proportionality states that even if there's clear military target, it is not possible to attack if the expected harm to civilians or civilian property is excessive in relation to the expected military advantage. You might be thinking this is highly subjective. Who's to decide if the harm to civilians is relative to the military advantage? It's actually subjective for a reason. This is a feature, not a bug. International law is hard to enforce. So when it was created, and this was created before we had the international courts like the ICC and ICJ. So when this was created, there was even less way to enforce it. And if it's too strict, countries are just going to ignore it. So international law is, call it, vague enough to get countries to buy in and agree to because it's not enforceable. So many will say, yeah, we've killed 100,000 civilians, but we have secured Gaza. That's worth it. Some might say that's worth it. Most people, I think, would agree that the cost has been far too high, and it seems like the international courts will ultimately agree with this. I often hear many people claim that all those killed are the responsibility of Hamas. I mean, it's interesting how otherwise intelligent people get really dumb when it comes to defending their side or a position that they're passionate about. It's such an illogical way to view the world. Our morality should not be determined by a terror organization. Right. So if Hamas has put their people in danger, that doesn't take away our responsibility to not cause harm to civilians. Why would it? All that means is we are determining our morality based on the morality of a terror organization. Let's take an analogy, and no analogy is one for one, but let's say you have a hostage situation. You call in SWAT. SWAT determines that it's going to be hard to get them out without us losing any of our own. So you know what? We're just going to destroy the entire neighborhood. That's essentially what Israel's doing. Okay. Very few people would say, it's the hostage takers. They shouldn't have done it. No, we would clearly say SWAT has an obligation to try to deal with this hostage situation in a way that's not going to cause so much civilian harm. Nobody's going to think that SWAT doesn't have any responsibility. So why do we think that the IDF has no responsibility? It doesn't make any sense. And the whole idea that you could be in the belief that Hamas is a terror organization that needs to be destroyed, but also they're responsible for the lives of their people, that's not a coherent position. It's contradictory. And for good reason, international law prohibits this. Now, let's talk for a moment about why this is important in international law. All countries, as I mentioned, are going to look out for their people more than the people of their enemy. This is consistent throughout history. Israel is not unique in preferring their soldiers over the civilians of their enemy. So this would mean a good strategy, if you don't care about civilians of the other side, a good strategy is to not send your troops in to be killed. It's just to flatten the city, flatten it from above, take as little risk as possible, right? International law was created for just this reason, to stop that from happening, because it's aware of the incentives and it's aware that all militaries will prefer their own. So to avoid militaries from destroying cities, we put responsibility on the warring parties, on both sides. And that it makes perfect sense, right? Now, the IDF strategy does seem to be similar. Yes, they have sent ground troops in and have lost hundreds. But relative to what many predicted, it's actually a relatively low military casualty count, because it does seem like they're often making decisions to act in a way that will harm civilians at the expense of putting their soldiers in danger. Which, again, it's understandable, but international law was created to prevent just this from happening. Let's get a little bit deeper into the strategy. So we can't know everything about Israel's strategy and motivations. Many say they're directly targeting civilians. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have evidence of an intentionality of trying to kill as many civilians as possible. But we do know that the flatter Gaza is, the easier it is to engage, right? You have this massive tunnel network underneath Gaza. You don't know where the exits of these tunnels are. We also don't know which buildings Hamas might use to attack IDF soldiers. In order to determine this, where the tunnels are and what buildings they might use, it requires a very careful approach where you go building to building. It's much slower and it's much more dangerous to soldiers. So you could see the strategy to not wanting to take this risk, and let's just level Gaza. And that would explain why we are seeing record levels of infrastructural damage. You could see how this is just a clear strategy to reduce harm to your military. So when looking at war crimes, there's two types of war crimes. There's systemic war crimes, which are actually coming from above as a command. The other are just individual soldiers breaking ranks and committing these crimes. We are seeing both in Gaza. The systemic ones are much harder to prove, but I say with a high degree of certainty that ultimately the international courts, as well as the court of public opinion, will agree that systemically what Israel is doing is immoral and constitutes a war crime. One of them is just a very low level of proportionality. The low level of proportionality meaning a large amount of harm to civilians relative to the military gain. I think it's a lower level of proportionality than we've seen in any other conflict in recent history. There was a whistleblower report from IDF intelligence officers talking about the Where is Daddy protocol, which essentially says if it's a high-ranking militant, we can kill them and their entire families, up to, I believe it was 20 people per militant. This is what the whistleblower report says. This seems to be corroborated by a lot of the death toll we're seeing and the amount of civilians being killed. Also, when you look at the names of those being killed, we see that there's actually a lot of full families that have just been wiped out, just full families gone. Whereas Daddy points to this being a matter of policy. Again, many will say that's fine. We could kill 20 civilians if we get some Hamas commander. We don't have enough information as to how these day-to-day decisions are being made. What is the importance of that commander? How many civilians are being killed? This is a consideration of proportionality Israel is making all the time. The other is just the infrastructural damage. Infrastructural damage needs to be justified. If it's civilian infrastructure, you need a good justification to do it. To destroy 80% of the buildings in Gaza is horrific. It plays a massive disproportionate toll against civilians. This is a systemic issue. This is a command from above. And another policy that is part of this infrastructural damage that individual soldiers are carrying out, but there's reports that it's a command, is burning homes. So if an IDF unit stays in a home, once they leave the home, they burn it down. Why do they burn it down? Just in case they left something there. They don't want Hamas to get it. So instead of taking 30 minutes to an hour to look through the home and make sure you didn't leave anything, they're going to destroy a civilian's home with all their belongings inside. It just shows the general disregard for civilian life to burn down a home instead of taking 30 minutes to see that you didn't leave anything. Right? This policy, which we've seen done by multiple units, as well as whistleblowers saying that this is a command, and there's many videos of this as well. So this is on a systemic level, right? Just a low level of proportionality and just massive infrastructural damage, not only to civilian homes, but to vital infrastructure like medical facilities, power plants, water plants, cropland, roads. Gaza has been destroyed. Hamas has not yet been destroyed. Another thing that was, also points to just the lack of care. There was this Day Tayman case where there's alleged gang rape by 9 prison guards, but there was a report put out by Breaking the Silence, I believe it was, where they interviewed 54 people who were released from Israeli prisons. There's not one prison. There's 18 prisons that detain Palestinians. They released 54 people spanning all those prisons, right? So they got some data from every prison. The fact that these people were released is a sign that they're innocent. You generally do not release terrorists, certainly not during war. That should point to us that some amount of those being arrested are civilians, generally military-age men. And what these people said shows that it's a systemic issue. It's not just Day Tayman. No one else reported sexual violence, but all of them reported horrific conditions, torture methods like being left in a light room, being left in uncomfortable positions, being made to stand, well overcrowded. Some mentioned physical abuse. Again, it's a systemic issue across the prison system. By the way, the prison system is controlled by Itamar Ben-Gvir, who many would consider him a fascist. He's certainly a far-right extremist. So he has direct impact over the prison system. So it's not surprising why we're seeing a systemic issue in prisons, where we're seeing horrific abuses towards Palestinian prisoners, some Hamas, others innocent. And it doesn't matter if you're innocent or not, you should not be tortured, right? It's almost not relevant that many of those being tortured are maybe innocent. On an individual level, what are the crimes being committed? Well, I want to just try to give greater perspective on the IDF and why we're seeing this happen, right? The IDF is, relatively speaking, an undisciplined military. It's primarily 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. They're not making a career out of the military. They're doing it because you need to do 3 years. Compared to other nations, the IDF is very undisciplined. We also have a relatively high degree of ethnic hate, right? Israelis and Palestinians have been fighting now for over 100 years. This creates hate. And again, I want to be clear. I don't blame people. I blame systems and institutions. That's what I try to change. Humans are acting as humans otherwise would. I actually don't blame Israelis for their aggression. I blame the system that is allowing this to happen. Same goes with the Palestinians. I don't blame the individuals for believing certain things or supporting certain things. It's the systems and institutions impact how people see things. So I'd rather focus on that. You change a system, you change an institution, there's a major trickle-down effect. That's the focus of my efforts. But there is a high degree of ethnic hate. There's also a high degree of anger. After October 7th, there was so much anger. That anger still exists. It pushed a lot of people over the edge. It really radicalized a lot of Israelis to the point where some amount of Israelis started openly supporting genocide. They said, there are no civilians in Gaza, flatten Gaza, we don't care. This is not the majority, but this certainly constitutes some percentage of the Israeli population. And this is actually to be expected. This is what happens when you are at war with the population. So we have low discipline, high degree of anger, relatively high degree of ethnic hate, and you have a society that very much cherishes their soldiers. So it's very controversial to hold a soldier accountable. So you have all these things, lack of discipline, a lot of hate, but you don't have good internal regulation. We saw what happens when we try to internally regulate. When there was the alleged gang rape in this Day Tayman prison, 9 prison guards were arrested. That same day, some Israelis raided the prison and the courthouse, including a politician and a member of the IDF. This was not only the most fringe people in society. There's a social and political cost to holding soldiers accountable, which decreases the amount of accountability we are going to see. There was a report that 70 soldiers being investigated in Gaza by Israel, which is great. This was only done after the ICC started investigating, which just shows the importance of the international courts. The way the ICC works is if you are going to investigate it yourself, we will not get involved. So it shows that the ICC's pressure did get Israel to increase their level of internal regulation, but it's certainly not to the extent that is deterring enough soldiers from this lawlessness and recklessness in Gaza. And we will talk about exactly what we're seeing happening, but I didn't want to set the stage to understand why this is happening. So on one hand, we're seeing executions. Is an execution just putting somebody on their knees and shooting them in the back of the head? We haven't seen any evidence of this. I'm not saying that's what's happening. But people waving white flags getting shot, people who are clearly civilians or under the age of 18 being shot. We have video evidence of this. We have drone evidence of this. We have testimonials corroborating this. people are being shot. Unarmed people are being shot. What is one good example of this that really kind of solidifies some of this lawlessness we're seeing? 3 hostages escaped captivity and were approaching the IDF waving white flags. All 3 of these hostages were shot dead by the IDF. And it wasn't just one sniper that shot all 3 of them dead. The entire unit opened fire on them. One of them started running away, and the unit chased him and killed him. So it wasn't just one soldier that was acting recklessly. It was an entire unit that were targeting and then chasing people waving white flags, which is certainly a violation of international law. This same unit, on October 7th, killed 4 militants, unarmed militants. And how do we know? We saw them upload a photo of 4 militants lying dead with guns next to them. But there was also drone footage that was released showing these 4 militants coming out of the bushes unarmed, getting on their knees. You then see the same unit that killed the hostages run up to them and shoot them, executed them. They were on their knees, they executed them, they then moved guns next to them and took the photo. Right? So I'm not saying every unit and every soldier is acting this way. That's not the case. And I also want to say that a lot of this recklessness comes from a place of fear. When your life is at risk and you have close to no regard for the enemy, why would you take any risk of your own life? No, you're just going to shoot first, ask questions later, right? That's essentially what we're seeing. And some units are acting more recklessly than others. This unit that killed the hostages and killed the unarmed militants and planted guns next to them, that's certainly a unit that is committing war crimes. And there's no reason to believe that they are the only one. Again, we have evidence from different places of Gaza where we see other units and we're seeing similar things happening. And I'm not saying this is the majority. I want to be clear. It doesn't take a majority to have a horrific situation. Even if it's only 10%, even if it's only 5%, when there's no accountability, that is all too many and going to harm civilians. What else are we seeing on an individual level? We're seeing theft. How do we know theft is happening? Because IDF soldiers are literally uploading videos of themselves stealing stuff. And this also speaks to the lack of discipline. If we look at the amount of videos that have come out of Gaza, it's quite unprecedented. We have videos coming out of Gaza of IDF soldiers committing war crimes. They're uploading their own war crimes to social media. Think about that. Think about how confident you need to feel in what you're doing and that there won't be consequences or backlash, not consequences from the military or social backlash. They're going to upload a video of yourself doing something that is either immoral or just straight up against international law, like theft, like property damage. We're seeing a lot of videos of people destroying property, including medical equipment. We're seeing dehumanizing behavior like wearing lingerie of Palestinian women. We're seeing prisoners being dehumanized, being left in uncomfortable positions, being tied up, and then photos taken of them and uploaded to the web. These are all things that IDF soldiers themselves are uploading to social media. And we know that the most horrific things are not going to be filmed and uploaded. But this does speak to the lack of discipline and the lawlessness we are seeing. And it shows that, by and large, the society is going to either be okay with it, either support it, or at the very least turn a blind eye. Because if there was a social consequence to this, they wouldn't feel that same confidence uploading it on social media. Now, I want to try to tie this all together, right? How we're getting to this situation where we're seeing just an unprecedented amount of war crimes and very little accountability. President of Israel, Herzog, on October 12th, 2023, and important to say that president is more of a symbolic role. It's not, you don't actually have a political role. It's more symbolic, but it's an influential role in Israeli society. In a press conference, Herzog said it's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true, this rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved. It's absolutely not true. And we will fight until we break their backbones. This is a sentiment that many Israelis believe. I mean, the fact that the president will say this at a press conference, this was not considered controversial by Israelis. Many agree with this. So clearly, if this is your mindset going into Gaza, you're not going to take civilians into consideration. Polling shows that over 70% of Israelis don't think civilian well-being should be taken into consideration, to either no extent at all or to just a little degree should be taken into consideration. This isn't unusual, right? I think this is going to be similar numbers when any two parties are warring, when there's a high degree of ethnic hate. But we do see that the population, generally speaking, don't think that their well-being should be taken into consideration. The conditions are ripe for this happening. And again, I don't blame people for having these views. I really don't. These are my family members. My family members hold these views. But when people have these views, and there's so much anger and so much pain and so much hate, there needs to be a higher level of discipline and a higher level of accountability. There has to be. This needs to be an expectation of us that soldiers going into combat need to be held to a high standard. They have to be. Let me just read a few more quotes just to get a better sense from IDF whistleblowers. "There was a total freedom of action," said B, another soldier who served in the regular forces in Gaza for months, including his battalion's command center. "If there's even a feeling of threat, there is no need to explain. You just shoot. It is permissible to shoot at their center of mass, not in the air. It's permissible to shoot everyone, a young girl and an old woman." B seems to be referring to the no-go zones, which we spoke about. This is the general sentiment. In the no-go zone, you can just shoot. Another whistleblower says, "Shoot first, ask questions later. That was the consensus. No one will shed a tear if we flatten a house when there was no need, or if we shoot someone who we didn't have to." Another quote, "It is forbidden to walk around, and everyone who's outside is suspicious," B continued. "If we see someone in a window looking at us, he is a suspect. You shoot." The perception is that any contact endangers the forces. Any contact with any Gazan endangers the forces. And a situation must be created in which it is forbidden to approach the soldiers under any circumstances. The Palestinians learned that when we enter, they run away, right? So we are seeing the complexity, right? How a lot of what's happening is not just hate. A lot of it stems from fear. You are going to value your life, your friends' lives, over those of the enemy. So if you see a Gazan coming near you, maybe it's a 16-year-old boy, maybe they need help. They very well might be suspected of being a militant, and in many instances are being shot. Another challenge is a lack of external regulation. The US, for the most part, is supportive of Israel and will continue to fund Israel. We have seen some change in European countries that have distanced themselves from Israel and spoken against the war. Countries such as Italy, Japan, Spain, Canada, Netherlands, and Belgium have ceased the sale of weapons to Israel. This is great news and shows that protests work, but the United States still very much will support Israel with what they do. Another thing is Israel does not pay for their weapons to nearly the same extent as other countries. They're heavily subsidized by the United States. Either they get weapons entirely for free or they get funding that is then meant to be spent on US weapons. Every time you drop a bomb, that's expensive. But if you only need to pay for a fraction of that, you're actually incentivized to drop more bombs. Again, I want to make it clear. Countries respond to incentives. Israel has a unique of incentives. So it's essential to understand incentives, and by understanding incentives and how to change them, you change systems and institutions. So let's really summarize this, right? You have a war being led by Netanyahu, who needs to appease Ben Gvir and Smotrich, sending in a low-disciplined army that has a high degree of hate, fear, and anger, lack of internal regulation, lack of external regulation, and heavily subsidized weapons. That is a recipe for disaster, and that is exactly what we're seeing. So what do I suggest? What's an alternative? What could we do differently? My first suggestion is going to be, call it a bit more radical. Radical in the sense that the world is almost not even ready for this, but I'm saying this because I believe this is where we need to move towards as a species if we are to make progress. October 7th happened, which was absolutely horrific. And Israel has the right to respond. They do. A sovereign nation has the right to respond to such an attack. But we could have been quite collected and rational about it and analyzed the situation and said, okay, we now have 250 hostages in Gaza. If we go in militarily, what is sure to happen? We know we're going to lose soldiers, our own soldiers. We know we're going to kill many civilians. We know there's a high chance we risk not getting the hostages back and even killing them in airstrikes. We know it's going to take a toll to the economy. Our credit rating's been reduced twice the past year. Brain drain happening in Israel, right? Israel's top talent, those who contribute the most to the economy, are leaving. A lot of this could have been predicted. We know it's going to isolate us internationally, and we know there's a chance it creates more wars on other fronts. But we don't even know for sure if this will destroy Hamas, right? So we could predict a whole lot of bad without guarantee of success. So we could have decided based on that, engaging them militarily in this way is not in our best interest. Not to mention, this is exactly what they wanted. They wanted us to engage them militarily in this way. So we could have recognized the cost it would have, and only so we could try to defeat Hamas and try to change the status quo. No guarantee of success. So we could have looked at more diplomatic means. A, putting international pressure on Hamas to return the hostages. We did have the sympathy of the international community for a few days, which we lost once they started seeing videos of dead children. We could have played the long game and understood that we don't have a way to defeat Hamas right now. The cost is going to be too great. Let's just continue with the trend of the Middle East that's warming up to Israel, right? We now have normalization with the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco, soon to be Saudi Arabia, and who knows who's next. Maybe if we have a coalition of Middle Eastern countries who recognize Israel's right to exist, we could put necessary pressure on Hamas to reform and change their ways. I get it. I understand the world is not quite ready for this approach, but it's very important for me to say this because I'm confident this is where we are going to move as a species. Human progress depends on us continually improving the care we have for civilian lives. So in the future, actually being rational about it and not reactive and not thinking they hit us, so we need to hit them harder. These are all very primitive, primal things. I truly believe we will grow out of it. So me, as somebody who wants to see the world go in that direction, I am putting that out as an option. That is a viable option that needs to be considered, that not everything needs to be dealt with militarily, especially when the military cost is so high. Now, let's assume we do go in, and I understand this is the general consensus that Israel should go in. Okay, well, if we go in, one thing we could do is have a much higher degree of care for civilians, actually have a much higher level of proportionality than we currently have. We could have given civilians ample time to evacuate Gaza. And people like to say, oh, no one would take him. Well, that's our responsibility to figure out. I'm sure we could have negotiated something. We could also let women and children into Israel and built a refugee camp in the Negev. It's true living in a refugee camp isn't good. It's true that taking in an enemy population is not favorable, but it's certainly preferred to killing them. And we often talk about Hamas education and how bad it is. Well, if you let women and children in, you have an opportunity to actually show them a different side and give them a different education and to start building ties with these Palestinians the same way Palestinian citizens of Israel are citizens and integrated. We have seen the capacity for peaceful coexistence when you're not growing up thinking that we are the enemy and when your only experience with us is in airstrikes and bombs, right? So the civilians are our responsibility. They are our responsibility. So we could have tried to evacuate them, either bring some amount into Israel or find a different country to evacuate them into. That's something that we could have done. I don't accept the fact that, oh, they have nowhere to go. You're not absolved of responsibility. Another is we could have done a whole lot without entering Gaza so deeply. We could create a massive buffer zone, right? We could systematically create a buffer zone without sending any troops in, taking ample time to evacuate the surrounding areas around Gaza and create a many-kilometer buffer zone to ensure something like this doesn't happen again. Also, this buffer zone gives you negotiating leverage. We also could have kept vital infrastructure intact, like hospitals, cropland, and water plants, right? We did not need to destroy this stuff, right? So we could have said, we're going in Gaza, but we're not going to destroy hospitals. We're not going to destroy cropland. We're not going to destroy this vital infrastructure. We're not going to do all this damage to homes. And if we're sending soldiers in, we need to hold them accountable for war crimes. So whether we go in or not, there's certainly a whole lot we could do differently. And the world has every right to expect this of a warring country. I want us to really think about the philosophy around war and what it means to kill civilians, right? Most people will agree that humans deserve the right to life, that this should be a fundamental right we have to live without it being taken from us. And all of a sudden when there's war, we're like, oh, it's just war, that's collateral damage. We have agreed that some people can lose their right to life because there is a greater mission at hand. Well, that's something pretty serious, right? To say that people are going to lose the right to life for a greater mission. And I acknowledge that there are some greater missions that very well might be worth some amount of collateral damage. And again, collateral damage is taking away a civilian's right to life. That's what it is. And I could see a situation where the benefit of war is great enough that taking people's right to life is worth it. But what are we actually talking about here? Hamas, on their most successful day in history, killed 800 civilians, which is horrific. But they don't pose an existential threat to Israel. Israel could have prevented another attack with better security. Again, we have a right to defeat them, but if the cost of defeating them is 100,000 dead civilians, hundreds of our own, a toll of the economy, being isolated internationally, if that's the cost of trying to defeat them, when we could prevent it with better security. So when you have a solution to your problem, the problem being an insecure border, and you could achieve that solution with killing close to no civilians, and you choose a solution that will kill 100,000 plus civilians, that's something very serious. And we shouldn't take that lightly. And if we're going to choose an approach that's going to kill civilians, well, that's the military that should be led by somebody who we trust, who's not self-interested and just wants to stay in power. Have it be led by somebody who doesn't need to appease far-right voices in his cabinet. And we need a higher level of accountability if a country is going to engage in war. Again, to decide that you could kill tens of thousands of civilians in order to prevent another attack, that's a very serious decision, not one that should be taken lightly. And I do think that in the future, we will look back on how Israel is engaging in Gaza, or just modern warfare in general, Syria, Iraq. We will view these conflicts and see them as completely barbaric, similar to the barbarity of October 7th. We have this idea that, oh, when you shoot somebody at point blank, it's barbaric, it's evil. But when you kill a family with an airstrike, oh, that's just war. That framing, how we see things, that's going to change. That almost certainly is going to change. We're going to see this operation in Gaza as absolutely barbaric and immoral. There's no doubt in my mind. Yeah, we have a horrific situation in Gaza. We have an unprecedented amount of children killed, civilian population killed. We're seeing disease and malnutrition. Hamas is still in power in the sense that they're not near being defeated. It's unclear how many more years we will need to stay in Gaza. And yeah, people are rightfully upset. And, I'm hearing a lot of talk that anyone criticizing Israel, it must be anti-Semitism. How dare you not let Israel defend themselves? It's perfectly legitimate to be against this. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Does anti-Semitism fuel the anti-Israel movement? Without a doubt. But to just say it's anti-Semitic to be troubled by what Israel's doing, you're doing a major disservice. You're diluting the meaning of the term. People don't take accusations of anti-Semitism seriously anymore for this reason. And I'm also troubled by seeing how many fellow Jews are just denying what's happening in Gaza. And I get it. You don't want to acknowledge that a country that you love is doing something wrong. I get it. But us Jews, more than anybody, should understand the pain that comes with atrocity denialism. It's been done to us forever. People still deny the Holocaust. People still deny the atrocity of October 7th. So we should understand better than anybody the pain that comes with atrocity denialism. So to see so many fellow Jews who are just denying what's happening in Gaza, it's hard to see. It really is. So I think we'll end it on that. I know what I say may be upsetting to many people, but I hope that you put your anger not towards me, who just wants to see less people dying to see Israel thrive, but put it towards the war crimes being committed and the actions being taken that are harming civilians. This should trouble you. And even if you don't care about Palestinian civilians and you just care about Israel, well, this is putting Israel at risk. Israel is losing international support. Our economy is taking a blow. We can't deal with multiple fronts at once. The past year should have shown us Israel's vulnerability. And if you care about Israel, you should recognize that the only way to ensure our survival on this land is through peace. Living by the sword will ultimately be our demise. We need to find a better way. I hope to see the end of bloodshed soon enough. More than anything, I just want to see peace on the land. I want to see Israelis and Palestinians living side by side with one another, as I know we can.